With an engine rebuild or overhaul, our goal is to bring the engine back to factory specifications. In other words, to make the engine like new. This involves attention to detail and closely adhering to specifications and tolerances. You need to do a complete inspection of the components before any cleaning is done. First, do a visual inspection to see if there are any obvious problems that could have caused a failure. The next program in this series is titled Engine Failure Analysis. It will include more detailed information on identifying the causes of failures. In this program, we'll cover a few of the most important inspection and measuring procedures. For a more detailed list, use the information in the workshop manual specific to the engine you're repairing. It's a good idea to use a check sheet, like the one in the reference manual, to record the measurements you observe. Study the results of the oil sample analysis. They can be very helpful. In this case, the oil was found to have a high concentration of dirt. Now that's your first real clue. If you remember, when the air cleaner assembly was checked, the wing nut was missing its sealing washer. There was also dirt in the intake hoses beyond the filter assembly. The next step is to do a thorough inspection of all the components for signs of failure. Inspect the pistons and rings for signs of wear. You must also look at the connecting rods, piston pins, the rod and main bearings. Inspect the cylinder block for cracks or other damage. Look for excessive scale buildup or other blockage in the water passages in the block. If you find any buildup, have it chemically removed. Inspect the crankshaft and the camshaft for damage and signs of bending or breakage. You should also inspect all the gears and the fuel injection camshaft assembly. Check the cylinder head for cracks or other signs of damage. The next step is to clean each component thoroughly, then lay them out again in sequence on the table. Kubota workshop specifications indicate the terms reference value and allowable limit. The reference value is the factory specification, the measurement of the component when new from the factory. The allowable limit is the rebuild specification, measure the piston pin bore, and compare the measurements to the specifications. Replace all components that don't meet those specs. Measure the cylinder with a bore gauge at the 6 points shown in the workshop manual. Record the differences and make sure they're within specifications. To measure piston ring wear, place a ring into the cylinder at the lower, least worn part. Use the piston to position the ring Then measure the gap with a feeler gauge. Take a look at a new set of rings. Notice that each ring on a Kubota engine is different. The top ring is of the keystone type, the second ring is an undercut type, and the third is an oil ring with cambered contact faces and an oil expander. The rings have marks on the top surface. When you install them, make sure they're in the correct grooves and that the manufacturer's mark near the gap of the ring faces the top of the piston. If the top ring is mistakenly installed upside down, it will break during reassembly. Make sure all the pistons are thoroughly cleaned with carburetor cleaner, then install new rings. Roll each ring in the piston groove to be sure there's no binding or ring distortion. Measure the clearance between the piston ring and groove. and make sure they're within specifications. The best way to clean the block is with a vibrator sander and 220 grit paper. The fine grit paper will remove the buildup without abrading the metal. If the block isn't cleaned properly, it may appear to be warped because the buildup distorts the measurements. Check the cleaned block surface for warping with a straight edge and a feeler gauge, and compare the results to specifications. Blocks can't be machined, so if problems are found, you must replace the block. Minor scoring of the cylinder can usually be removed by honing. If after honing the measurement exceeds the allowable limit, then the cylinder block will have to be serviced. Some engines are equipped with liners like this one. The liner may be removed by a special tool or by a machine shop. A new liner is then pressed into place and bored to finished dimensions, then honed with a crosshatch. The standard pistons and rings can then be used. If the engine does not have a liner, or if you don't want to replace the liner, the cylinder can be bored to oversize, honed with a crosshatch, and oversized pistons and rings installed. By the way, after boring and honing, you must thoroughly clean each bore with hot soapy water to remove the metal dust. Grit from the hone can become embedded in the micropores of the liner, and if not removed, will cause rapid wear of the rings. Many overhauls have failed as a result of this oversight. The cylinder head should be cleaned with a sander and 220 grit paper, just like the block. Then, wash it with hot soapy water and dry it under a heat lamp. Inspect the cleaned cylinder head. Look for cracks at the combustion chambers and valve areas. Using a straight edge, measure all 4 sides and 2 diagonals with a feeler gauge. Check the workshop manual for the procedure. Use red die check to find hidden cracks. Cracks will usually show up between the valves. If the cylinder head hasn't been cleaned properly, you may not be able to see the cracks. Next, measure the valve guides, valve faces, and inspect each valve. Repair or replace all worn parts. If the cylinder head is warped and must be machined with a surface grinder, a shim is available to make up the clearance between the valve and the top of the piston. That will keep the top clearance within specifications. If machining is to be done on the head, remove the combustion chamber before grinding. There are 2 good reasons for doing this. First, the chamber is made of a much harder material and can damage the grinding tool. Secondly, machining the chamber's surface will weaken the chamber and make it more susceptible to cracking. After the cylinder head is machined, take off the same amount of metal from the bottom side of the chamber. The chamber must be reinstalled correctly to ensure proper operation. Refer to the reference manual for more detailed information on Super 5 engines and other models. For valve and valve guide inspection and machining, see the detailed information in the workshop manual. Follow the procedures in the workshop manual for any other important inspections and measurements required. Be sure to replace all components that do not meet specifications.